So the Tigers have always been called the Tigers. So teams change names all the time, right? You know, their nicknames, they change cities. They have been the Detroit Tigers since they started in 1901. Nothing ever changed.
They are in the same club as a few other franchises. I believe the Yankees have always been.
No, they were the Highlanders.
Oh, correct. Right. So they've just always been the Tigers. There's never been another iteration of the
And I think the Yankee franchise goes back to Baltimore, actually, before that even.
Right.
So
it's been the Detroit Tigers and only the
right. There's
Tigers.
other franchises that are like that, but and I always think about the Tigers because the old English D that they have on the cap and all that stuff, which they still maintain to this day, and something worn proudly by Private Eye Thomas Magnum when Tom Selleck was playing him. I just love that about the old Magnum stuff that he always had the Detroit Tigers because he's a Michigan guy and a Tiger fan.
I'm
Anyway,
sure he was a big Tiger fan.
You'd have to know that little inside stuff, but he was a big Tiger fan and he would watch Tiger games on the TV. And I became a Tiger fan as a kid because they won the World Series when I was about 8-9 years old, so I was very focused on them. But they're a 4-time winner,
and I certainly they are an iconic baseball franchise, if only one that has been mired in a long period of not good baseball, I think, to put mildly, for these past. I mean, they do have a World Series in the past 25-ish years,
No,
right?
they don't. So here's the thing, right? As Met fans, we always say the Mets haven't won since 1986, and that is fast becoming a very long time ago now, not compared to some of the people like the Indians, but the Tigers won it in 85. That was the last time they won it.
I thought they got one in like the mid 2000s for some reason.
Well, they got to the World Series.
Right, and then they lost to the Cardinals.
They lost to the Cardinals once, and then they lost another World Series with Miguel Cabrera. Well, no, that was the Cardinal World Series. Didn't they lose one in 05, I believe, as well?
No, I thought 05 was the White Sox.
The White Sox one. 06, they lost to the Cardinals in 06.
Yeah.
And so they also lost to the Cardinals in 12, was it? Right? Wasn't that?
Or no, the Giants would have been the Giants.
The Giants in 12. That's right. It was the Giants. That was the Miguel Cabrera Tigers.
Okay.
So, and not having won in, obviously as many years as they have since 85, it's that the more recent years, and we'll talk about their current team, they just haven't been very good now for over 10 years. And so since they made the World Series in 2012.
They made that World Series and had, I guess, what was a middle of his career, Justin Verlander at that point. I mean, the guy, I feel like he's been pitching for so long. It's kind of weird to think about what point he was at his career back then.
And that team, if I'm not mistaken, had both. They didn't have both Max because Max was gone already by the time Verlander was there to take him through that particular aspect of it.
Right. I think Max was gone at that point, but I think it was like Anibal Sanchez might have been one of their pitchers that. Right. I'm not 100% sure who else were the big arms that team.
We'll have to look at that 2006 team.
Right. They had a lot of good arms on that 2012 team.
2012 team, yes. So they've played in, and one of the cool things for me is I got to go to Tiger Stadium when I was a kid. My dad took us on a fishing trip with a friend of his through business up in Canada on Lake St. Clair, and so we flew into Detroit, and I don't know how he knew somebody with the Tigers, and so they drove us over to the park, and we get out of the car, we go in the park, and I'm pretty impressed. I'm getting to go like on the field, right?
So this is like a big deal.
I've never okay, this is pretty special. I'm going on the field at Tiger Stadium. I've never been on the field at Shea,
This is cool.
And Tiger Stadium had the rafters.
That's what I always think of.
So first time I looked down from it was so cool because basically the rafters looked like you could almost touch the first baseman on the shoulder from like the second level because it was like you were like right over them. The overhang was so far.
Wow.
And then and of course it was really far, but as a little kid there was a little flag way out in center field. And I was like, yeah, that was the home run that Reggie Jackson hit in the 1971 All-Star game that hit the light tower. And they had put a flag out there with it. And I'm like, I can't believe how far that is.
Like you could actually appreciate.
Yeah, because I was on the field standing there.
And I always think of that old Tiger ballpark as one of the most iconic major league stadiums of all time. Just
couldn't agree more.
The look of it was so. There was no. It was just one of those parks that you immediately saw and knew what stadium it was. Just one of the old baseball video games I played had Old Tiger
Right.
Park in it. That was one of my favorite stadiums to play because it looked so cool.
It's so classic baseball. So that park and was the original because Navin Field was called Navin Field to begin with, and then they changed it to Briggs Stadium, they popularly called it Tiger Stadium just because the Tigers had always played there, and so the same park. So it was called 3 different names, and it ended up being called Tiger Stadium until they moved into Comerica in 2000.
And they've been there for a while now.
23 years. I've never been to Comerica Park. I don't know anybody that says anything one way. I couldn't speak anything about the park, good, bad, and different.
It's just a baseball park.
It's just a baseball park. I guess I'd like to go. I'd like to go to any park. But it is. The Tiger Stadium is one of the great ballparks of all time. So why don't we talk about some of the great Tigers before we talk about the more current teams? And so they and we remind that the World Series wins were in 1935. Okay, and in 1935 they beat the Cardinals. In 1945. I have to look up that World Series because I'm trying to think who they beat in that thing. The Cardinals won in 44 and 46, so maybe it was the Cardinals in 45 also. I'll have to check the 35 one. I'm not sure about that now. They won in 1984, the Kirk Gibson Tigers. They started out 35 and 5, and they won 4 games to win the World Series against the San Diego Padres. And then they swept the World Series, I believe, in...
So they won back-to-back in 84 and 85?
No. 85. I was wrong about 85. Right. It wasn't the Padres. 84 was the World Series. Sorry, my bad. 84, Tigers beat the Padres.
Okay, so 85.
Not 85.
Okay.
I had the wrong year. And it's because the Royals won in 85. And then, so that's the last time that they won. So 35, 45, 68, I forgot to mention. And that was the World Series where Bob Gibson struck out the 17 Tigers in Game 1. And everybody talks about that as like a seminal moment because TV really captured that. And the Tigers won in 7 games. And a guy named Mickey Lolich won 3 games in that World Series.
Didn't he win like 30 games one
season? Danny McLean won 30 games on that team. You're right. He was on that 68 team, the last guy to win 30 games. And Mickey Lolich beat Bob Gibson in Game 7. Something nobody really talks about at all. How great Gibson was and all that stuff. But, as a matter of fact, the Tigers won that World Series.
Right. And I think it's interesting that, one of the things we were talking about with our Braves discussion last week, just with the players, was that for a team that had been around as long as the Braves had, they didn't have as many all-time greats, in terms of like really truly pantheon level baseball players that a franchise that had been around.
Well, certainly you couldn't go like around the diamond as much as you can for other teams.
The Tigers don't have that problem.
No, they don't. So
even their weak positions are. Weak is not a great term to describe them.
Well, and the good thing is that it's funny how it works, though. You'll see this happen here, too. Like, some of them, they have multiple guys that could be that guy. And other things, like there's a guy who's the guy, and then there's nobody else who's
the guy. But they still have a guy.
Right.
They don't have a position where there's just nobody.
Like at shortstop, there's Alan Trammell, right?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody would think it's Aaron. It really is. Because there's a guy named Donnie Bush, Doni. I'm not sure he dropped an N in his name or something like that.
There's not a lot of other Tiger shortstops.
Billy Rogel. I had to go looking, for these guys.
Certainly in my lifetime, I can't remember the shortstop position for the Tigers being a great one.
No, and obviously Alan Trammell is the standard bearer there. Just like at third base, George Kell, who is a Hall of Famer, name you've heard of, but you don't know nothing else about him. There aren't a lot of other third basemen.
Well, I mean Miguel.
I put him at first base because he played more games there, I believe.
For them, okay.
Yeah. I always would have think,
and that's interesting because that makes first base crowded for them, I'm sure.
It does, and you bring up a good point. So let's run over to first base. There is Hank Greenberg, Hall of Famer. Yeah, that Miguel Cabrera.
He's pretty going to be Hall of Famer.
Right? Who do you pick between those guys? And a guy I really loved as a kid, Norm Cash, who has 360 home runs in his career and was a fine major league ball player.
A guy that would maybe be the best player at that position for a lot of other teams.
Yes. Norm Cash is probably underrated because those guys are
Right.
are Tiger first baseman. In your pitcher, so I always talk about this trivia question when you try to go around the diamond and you pick back-to-back MVPs. Okay, and so you can go around. There's more guys because Barry Bonds did it after there were already 3 outfielders. You don't have to do it by position. But when you get to the pitcher, that's the one that always stumps people because they don't know that this fine pitcher Hal Newhouser won back-to-back MVPs for the for the Tigers. So he, by virtue of that and being a Hall of Famer, I kind of give him the nod over Verlander.
Right, you kind of have to give it to. I mean, even though Verlander is going to be a Hall of Famer,
and I just couldn't give it to Jack Morris. Although, if you look at Jack Morris's stats while he was with the Tigers, they're very good.
so yeah, he was a big pitcher, not just that one season. I think because you kind of remember him more as a mercenary.
Right, going to Minnesota and winning
Right.
Game 7 of that. No, he was a great pitcher with the Tigers, a greater
For a
pitcher
long
with the
time.
Tigers than he was exactly for the Minnesota Twins. There were other great Tiger pitchers over the year, but those guys, Denny McLain, we talked about
Right.
winning 31 games.
I mean,
but
even Mickey Lolich,
Mickey Lowe, I'm glad you said that because, this is not a Hall of Fame pitcher.
but he was a very good pitcher.
He's a Hall of Very Good pitcher, as you like
Oh,
to
yeah,
say.
for sure.
He's right there. Came and pitched for the Mets late in his career. It was not good.
Yeah, he was like most people that come.
It was,
to the Mets
it was
late
not
in
good.
their career,
That's not
very
the
good.
guy we thought we were getting.
We thought we were getting the Mickey Lolich of about 7 years before that.
So at catcher, I talk about this guy all the time because I think he's a guy who has a case for the Hall of Fame in Bill Freehan. And Bill Freehan was an interesting looking guy, and his baseball card is remember because he had like kind of Vulcan-like ears. And I remember looking at him and going, that's a really strange looking dude, but he's a good
I
player.
mean, Ivan Rodriguez played some years for the Tigers.
He played
right?
5 seasons, which is why I didn't give him.
Right.
I don't know if 5 is a
Five's
chance
probably
to
not
be an
quite
all-time
enough.
Tiger.
Right, and it's tough because sometimes you get guys like that where it's like he's sort of the all-time catcher for the Rangers, just sort of by default.
Right. I would think that would be the club if I had to
Right.
pick him as one that he would do that for. Lance Parrish, I don't know how much you
don't.
Another guy who was a perennial all-star,
Mm-hmm.
good defensive catcher, very good defensive catcher, power hitter. I don't know what his. We're going to do this in another episode. I'd say his career war is in the 30s. Just for catchers, which is harder to do anyway. But I would probably give it to Bill Freehan, and those are 3. Mickey Cochran was on the 35 Tigers when they won the World Series, but he actually did more for the Cardinals than he did for the Tigers. So I think that's where he was before. That wasn't his primary team. Is the point? He only played 4 seasons in
Yeah,
Detroit.
okay.
Mickey Cochran might have been the A's. I'm wrong. It's not the Cardinals. So we talked about Trammell. We talked about George Kell. So then you go to the outfield.
Right, and Ty Cobb is going to take up one of these.
Yeah, he could probably take up all 3 because he doesn't need anybody else.
Right.
Ty Cobb.
It's been interesting because we've been watching Ken Burns' baseball documentary, and they just go in so hard on Ty Cobb in this. Just you could clearly tell they were not a big fan of him.
Ken Burns had an issue, and he was taken to task a little bit about people who sort of said, well, it's fine not to call, Cobb the most wonderful guy in history, but the vitriol and the way they paint him as a racist, which he definitely displayed racist tendencies sometimes from the way we look at it now. But at the time, I think we make up these stories and kind of plug him in going, oh, man, this is guy, he's a guy we don't want anything
And there
to
were
do with.
already so many stories about him, but as a ball player, purely as a ball player, he certainly deserves the nod.
Al Kaline, we've talked about
Right.
a lot on this podcast. Obviously,
Another Hall of
with the
Famer.
399 home runs and came up at 19 and was just a phenom and played his whole career in Detroit, thankfully, as far as I'm concerned. Harry Heilman, who sounds like he should have been an
Not Aaron's
agency.
father, correct?
No, different Heilman, spelled differently. Should have been an ad exec's name instead of being a I think he's a Hall of Fame center fielder.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, that's 3 Hall of Fame outfielders
Let's-
right there.
let's-
There's not a lot of teams that could boast 3 Hall of Fame outfielders like that.
We talked about the Expos having that,
Right.
right, like there. So let's see. Let me just look because I want to get that right.
And I think it's just interesting that you look at the Tigers, and that's we still didn't even talk about some of the better players. I mean, Lou Whitaker was a Tiger, correct? Or was he a White
We
Sox?
haven't gone to second. We haven't gone to second base yet, and you're 100% so. He is
The second baseman?
no.
He's not.
I have him second.
To who?
Charlie Gehringer, this guy who went into the Hall of Fame, also without a logo on his cap, played his entire season entire career with Detroit. And by the way, Harry Heilman is in fact a Hall of Famer.
Okay.
This is why it's so great to do the Tigers, right?
Right.
Because everybody is a
You basically have a Hall of Famer at every single position.
so Hall of Famer Charlie Gehringer, 84.8 career WAR.
That's up pretty. Wow. Wow.
So Lou Whitaker, take a seat because
Right.
Charlie Gehringer was better. Again, another guy who played his entire career. And the Tigers had that. Guys that played great players that played their whole career for the franchise and were great like the whole time.
Yeah, and certainly that has a mythos building element for your franchise and why there's just so many big name players that are part of the Detroit franchise. But the problem was when you look at a lot of those guys that we just named, they're all from really early in Detroit's history. It's from a lot of the guys where the only footage of them is in black and white, if there is footage of them.
I mentioned you're right, and because they haven't won a World Series since 1984, you kind of like that's probably why you don't have that many great players. Miggy's the only guy Hall of Fame wise. Verlander, he'll be a Tiger when he goes in, I think, as we like to talk about. Goose Goslin, one of my favorite old time players, only played 5 years for the Tigers, even though he was on the championship team in '35, so he gets a mention. Chet Lemon also played for the Tigers, the guy that I love, played for the White Sox, but he doesn't rate up there with the guys that we named.
No, certainly not with the guys that
Hall
we've
of
been
Famers
naming.
win in that particular instance.
Yeah.
Relief pitchers, boy, I had a hard time with this.
Right, notable time. They've had like guys that had really good seasons.
Right,
Like,
so the
I think
all-time
Joel Zamaya had an unbelievable.
Joel Zamaya, good pull on your part. Wow,
Like an unbelievable season
wow,
for them.
I love that. Todd Jones is the all-time leader in saves.
Right,
That's not going to get you very excited. The guy who. Before the save was a statistic, this guy was a good relief pitcher for the Tigers and has a really good career statistics as a pitcher. John Hiller, again, another guy
a guy that
never heard of.
Anybody that's a relief pitcher before the invention of saves is just a guy that is going to be inherently unheralded.
But he was doing closer type things before.
Because nobody cares.
His 125 career saves. Because retroactively they go back and credit
they
the
credit him
saves,
a bunch.
because the save wasn't until 1969. He started in 1965. So I guess he did get some official saves. Career 283 average, earned run average.
Oh, okay.
So just a very good pitcher who pitched in big situations. And I have him number one over Todd Jones because there's nobody else.
You're right. It's just not a position of. But I mean, relief pitcher outside of a couple franchises, there's not a lot of teams that have like a long history of excellent relief pitchers. It's kind of like it's a thing that's only come on recently.
Right. So I don't nothing that we hold against him at that point. So the all-time manager, I picked Sparky Anderson, and Sparky Anderson is also in the Hall of Fame.
Hall of Fame manager.
Right, and that's not like Jim Leland, but he made his mark with the Reds, obviously the big red machine, and then he comes over and he wins a World Series with the Tigers, which sort of cemented his, and he managed in Detroit much longer than I thought. He managed 17 years in Detroit and only 9 in Cincinnati, and yet because he was at the big red machine and they won the 2 World Series, I think of him as a Reds manager longer than the others. So that guy, I think, George Sparky Anderson. I had a friend of mine who really was annoyed with his name, going, a 70-year-old man should not be named Sparky.
It's like a dog.
There's
name.
nothing Sparky about a 70-year-old guy. So, but that's not true because
it was a very fiery personality.
he was exactly that. So. I think the only other things to look at is when we talk about is if you look at the names and of the batting leaders all time, right? The name Ty Cobb
kind of pops up.
It's kind of like Henry Aaron was for the Braves, when we did them last week. So it's Ty Cobb, and then Hank Greenberg. Comes in. Slugging percentage.
Right.
Okay, well, yeah, he would
home
have
runs. Hank Greenberg.
Let's see. Al Kaline gets games played. Strikeouts, Miguel Cabrera gets in there. These are the all-time records. There aren't very many. Bill Freeman hit by pitch. I mean, you're looking for something a little more.
Right. It's anybody that has anything significant that isn't Ty Cobb. But, I mean, that's how good Cobb was.
Right. And so if you go to the pitching side.
There's probably a lot of Verlander.
Well, it's a lot of Hal Neuheiser.
How many guys
Newhouser.
are right.
Max Scherzer in strikeouts per 9 innings. So that's an
Interesting.
interesting that he got there. Mickey Lolich leads in shutouts, also in home runs given up. Kind of a microcosm of his career. Great name who pitched a lot of years for them, Hooks Doss. Has the wins record, all-time wins for
How
the
many?
Tigers. 223 wins for the Tigers.
So they've never had a guy that's won 300 games just for them. But
That
I
is-
can't imagine there's too many teams that have
Right.
300 game winners that are only did that with that one team.
Hooks Doss, a lot like Cy Young, has the most losses for the Tigers as well with 182. He just pitched a lot. Justin Verlander is only on there for one statistic.
Really?
Yep, and that is situational wins saved, which is not a statistic that most of us are familiar with.
No, I'm not even-
including me.
Including me.
Jack Morris has wild pitches. So it's, again, the same people sort of dominate.
Right, and which is just sort of makes sense when we're talking about the best players. They're also going to dominate their historical records.
So, now the Tigers, they just recently hired Jeff Greenberg as general manager, and he comes over, I think, from the hockey side. And he was hired by Scott Harris, who's the Pobo, and I don't know who was I think Alex Avila was the last general manager. And before last season, we talked about the Tigers, and we said they're not ready. We think they had more of a clue as to where they were going than some of the other.
They
and
had a
they showed
year,
that.
They showed that they're certainly the type of team that's saying, okay, their goal this year is to probably try and at least push the Twins for the division crown and hopefully compete strongly and ideally win a wild card spot. I'd say that's the goal this year. That you're in second, you're jockeying with Minnesota, and provided Minnesota doesn't rip off some unbelievable season that you wouldn't expect them to.
My main concern would be, do they have pitching? I mean, and they've kind of done some things, but I don't really love their pitching, and they obviously last year they let Eduardo Rodriguez go, and they never had anybody to replace him.
They have a lineup that can do some damage, but I think it will come down to you need a pitcher to emerge from the minors. And I think they have some young arms they do. They are enamored with, but one of those guys needs to emerge and be a top flight MLB starter if all of a sudden you're going to be a team that is going to overachieve.
Right. And so, fortunately for them, they play in the American League Central,
Which is an eminently winnable
so
division.
you don't know. They certainly made great strides this year. I think they played
Oh, yeah.
better than I would have even expected them to. We expected them to be better. So, Tiger fans, I think you have something to look forward to, and you'll always have the logo. So, anyway, thank you for listening, everybody, and please, send us whatever kind of questions you might have, suggestions for episodes, and things that you might find interesting for us to talk about.